So welcome everyone following us on Zoom or on our Facebook feed. Welcome to this seminar on German foreign policy after the election. We are now 9 days away from election that marks the departure of Angela Merkel after 16 years as leader of Germany, and as important today, also as a very prominent person on the world stage. And judging by the debates, I guess that foreign security and European affairs is not really at the top of the agenda in the campaign, which I guess makes Germany a pretty normal European country. But outside of the campaign, the world has really made itself known. We've seen the chaotic departure from Afghanistan, the discussions on the future of interventions, the migration issue, but also seeing new debates within the EU on how to manage illiberal trends within member states. We've had just last week interesting discussions on international tech cooperation with the submarine issue with Australia and the UK, the US and France. And also I read today about new prospects for the EU teaming up with the UK on this planned intervention capacity, whatever that will bring. So whatever the coalition that will emerge after the election, a new German government will have to position itself and in some cases actually lead the development. Now, the world is a big place. So for this hour, we will focus on three themes, and that is what we can expect from Germany when it comes to security and defense cooperation, its dealings with China and to some extent the global tech war, and closer to home, its management of European affairs. And to help us unpack these issues, we have a stellar panel. We have Ulrike Franke, who is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and also the co-host of the Sicherheitshalber podcast on German security and defense policy, which I try to listen to work on my almost non-existent German. So thanks for that. We also have Tim Rudig, who's until recently my colleague here in the UI's Euro program, but now transitioning to the German Council on Foreign Relations, although physically he's still in Sweden. But he will leave for Germany, where Roderick Parks, head of the Alfred von Oppenheim Center at the German Council of Foreign Relations, will be waiting for him. And Roderick will speak about European affairs mainly today, although he has a broad agenda. So I'm very much looking forward to this, and I hope you in the audience are as well. Please engage with us and ask questions either in the Q&A function, which you find here in Zoom, or in our as comments to the Facebook feed. And hopefully I will see the questions and send them on to our excellent panelists. So I think let's get right to it, and starting with Ulrike. I mean, security and defense cooperation has really been high on the agenda after Afghanistan, at least in the more public European debates. And this, of course, ties to the ever ongoing discussion on strategic autonomy, for example. What should we be able to do in Europe on our own if no one else wants to help us? And Angela Merkel has been pretty vocal, at least during the Trump years, about the need for Europe to take our fate into our own hands, while the defense minister has perhaps been less enthusiastic at times, also including a public spat with the French president on the realism of this European strategic autonomy. But where are Germany now, and where can we expect Germany to be in the years to come on security and defense cooperation? Please, Ulrike.
Thank you very much, Björn, and thanks so much for having me. Yeah, so I mean, defense and security topics tend not to be a huge priority in German political campaigns and really in the German political debate in general. Anything that has to do with the military is usually, either the public is disinterested or actively rejects it, and that's a bit of a theme in Germany. So even though, Björn, as you mentioned, Afghanistan was and still to some extent is a big topic in the German media, I don't think it has led to a rethink of this general situation. Nevertheless, interestingly enough, I believe that defense and security topics, but defense topics in particular, may end up playing a relatively important role in coalition negotiations, because as you know, on the 26th of September, we'll vote, but we won't probably know who actually will be in government on that evening, because there will be a few weeks, if not months, of coalition negotiations. And these coalitions, and this time it could be a three-party, if not four-party, if you count the CDU, CSU as two parties, coalition in Germany, and so the agreement will take quite a while. And as I was saying, defense policy could actually end up playing a bigger role in these negotiations than they're playing in the public debate. And the reason for that is that there is one topic that the next German government will need to take a decision on one way or another, and even not taking a decision is taking a decision, and that's Germany's role in NATO's nuclear sharing. And I'll get to this in a second, but I just kind of wanted to put this out there already that you have it in your head. But let me very briefly make a few points. Number one, you kind of started this whole thing saying, Germany after Merkel, and we've all been focused quite a bit on Merkel and then also on the candidates. I would say that in this election, that the candidates, the 2 or 3 candidates of the main parties really have played quite an important role in swaying voters. But that's somewhat unusual for Germany, partly because we don't actually vote for the candidates. We vote for the parties, and then they, nominate the chancellor candidate. And interestingly enough, I think that on security and defense, the 3 candidates aren't so different from each other. And this has to do with the fact that I would say all 3, so, Laschet for the CDU, the Christian Democrat, Scholz for the SPD, and Baerbock for the Greens, they're all relatively middle of the road candidates for their parties, and don't represent really, the fringes or even in the case of Olaf Scholz and the SPD, the kind of main direction of the party. So I think on security and defense, these 3 candidates aren't necessarily the different, but the parties actually are. And let me kind of outline a few things, kind of conceptual things. So when you read the election programs of the parties, you find, quite different approaches to security and defense in general. For example, CDU, CSU, the Christian Democrats, they consider themselves as the parties of the Bundeswehr. Only parties that say this, the parties of the Bundeswehr, while the SPD, Social Democrats, call themselves the peace party. They kind of have a different approach here. The CDU, CSU actually say quite explicitly that the military is one tool of foreign policy, also something you don't hear that often in the German political debate. While the Greens are definitely more critical and skeptical of the military, and they actually propagate a feminist foreign policy. They want to introduce feminist foreign policy in Germany, which, generally tends to be more critical of the military and military means. So these are kind of, conceptual differences that matter, but also practically, the CDU wants 203,000 soldiers instead of the currently 185,000 that we have. That is current government policy, but there's a question of whether this will indeed be done. And importantly, on things like, NATO 2%, as probably everyone who listens here knows, Germany is supposed to spend 2% of its GDP on security and defense, as all the NATO allies are. We don't do this and haven't done for quite a few years. I mean, there's a question of, will we? The CDU says explicitly, yes, we believe in the 2% goal and want to reach it. The FDP, the Liberal Democrats, say it kind of implicitly. The SPD isn't really quite explicit, and the Greens, for example, just reject the goal completely because they say it's a stupid methodology, which I find a bit of a cop-out because they don't say it's a stupid methodology, but we would be willing to spend whatever amount. They just say we don't like the methodology and don't say how much they're going to spend. So there's a bit of an issue here. Because you've asked about kind of European cooperation, I think the parties in the middle, and I'm kind of leaving out the 2 fringes, the extreme left, the Linke, and the extreme right, the AfD, the parties in the middle all prescribe largely to the idea of remaining transatlantic, but becoming more European. That kind of, I think this was first coined by the CDU or Merkel, or I don't know, but it's very much German foreign policy at the moment. So there is this agreement that the US remains an important partner and an important security provider, but Europe, the EU, needs to do more. And they all say this, and actually even the European army, which I personally find a really annoying concept, even the European army makes appearance in quite a few party programs, election programs. I think the SPD mentions it, the Green mentions it, the FDP mentions it, a few mention it. And so the general direction is of doing more together on the European level. But here again, the devil lies a little bit in the details. For example, the Greens say they're all for European cooperation on defense. However, they actually have a sentence in their program that basically says that they oppose the current European Defense Fund. which, as you know, has been launched recently, because they consider this to be civilian EU money that has been dedicated for military means, and they're against this. So, potentially if they end up in government, they could say, we don't want the European Defense Fund anymore. So details matter here. And now finally, because I kind of hinted at this at the very beginning, I want to say 2 sentences on nuclear sharing. So Germany, as a few other European countries, is part of NATO's nuclear sharing. I mean, politically, all NATO countries are. Germany is a military part, and so far as it has American nuclear weapons stationed on German soil, and these nuclear weapons should, in theory, be transported by German aircraft and used by German aircraft. That is a very theoretical idea, because quite honestly, no military planner can really come up with a scenario where that actually happens, but it's still part of NATO's nuclear deterrence that we all depend on. Now, the problem is that the aircraft, the current German aircraft that are supposed to carry these nuclear weapons, are getting older and older, and they're supposed to be replaced, and we don't seem to be able to take a decision on what to replace them with and what to do here. And every government kind of has postponed this issue. The last 2 grand coalitions, because they couldn't really find a decision on this. And now we're basically approaching the point where if the next government doesn't replace these aircraft, Germany could sleepwalk out of nuclear sharing, because if we just don't buy any newer aircraft, at one point we will have to call the Americans and say, well, we're sorry, but we can't transport your weapons anymore, which isn't ideal. So yeah, the next government will need to take a decision on this. And looking at the party programs, the parties aren't exactly clear where they want to go on this. Anything regarding the nuclear power or nuclear weapons is super sensitive topic in Germany. We don't even like nuclear plants, so we certainly don't like nuclear weapons. But as I said, this decision will need to be taken, and I'm very curious to see where we're going to end up there. If I had to speculate, and then this is really speculation, a CDU-led government, so a government under Armin Laschet, is likely to just continue nuclear sharing, so buy some kind of planes that can carry these weapons. And SPD, or indeed Green, although it's unlikely, led government may not. And again, if Germany gets out of nuclear sharing, that's quite the statement, and that will cause quite some discussion in NATO and in Europe, and open a whole can of worms. So very interesting to see. And one final sentence, just because I kind of need to put a caveat on everything I say. Of course, we don't know who's going to win. We also don't know what coalition will form. But there's another level of difficulty, which is that if a coalition forms, we don't really know how much they will prioritize all things defense and security, and who will get which ministry, right? So if I'm making this up, but if you end up with a coalition of the SPD, the Greens and the FDP, it really matters whether the defense ministries goes to the Liberal Democrats, the FDP, or the Greens. And I can't tell you. And so, yeah, I'm afraid we will have to talk again in a few months' time. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulrike. Just to follow up on you mentioned the Afghanistan also and the kind of discussions. If we look at it right now, and also from the State of the Union address this week, at least as for now, what looks as coming out of this discussion is that we'll have another summit in France. We'll have another declaration together with NATO, and then we know that we will have a compass coming soon. Yes. This sounds really much like security policy as integration rather than creating action. Would that be in line with German preference? I mean, that is the image that's for several years, that Germany is really keen to have this as an area of integration rather than an area where we create functions that we use for things.
That's a very good point. I always say, when France and Germany talk about European defense, Germany looks at the European part and says, oh, great topic for European unity. And France looks at the defense part and says, great idea to create more defense. And so I think you're right that Germany, again, because the military isn't really a topic we like, my sense is that quite often this idea of doing stuff at the European level is actually almost an excuse, because then you don't need to do it at the national level. But that doesn't mean that we're really focused on capabilities at the European level. That being said, I actually got the sense that at least in Brussels, following Afghanistan, there is now more of a focus on capabilities. I mean, we're talking about these initial entry forces and all of this. I don't quite know what to make of this yet, but I feel that after a few years, basically since 2014, where the EU was focused quite a bit on institutions and has created the European Defence Fund that I mentioned, and PESCO, and all of these cool acronyms, we are moving into a situation where capabilities become more important and things are being built. So kind of baby steps on a European level. But I think your general assessment is correct. I mean, Germany is not going to lead the group of those saying, okay, let's actually build up and invest and then do more on the European level. I think that's a fair assessment pretty much for any coalition we can expect.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to you soon. But while we are in Europe, let's head over to Roderick. I mean, Merkel has been perhaps the most influential EU politician for during a range of different crises, the financial crisis, debt crisis, the migration issue, Brexit, both kind of managing crisis, but also forging consensus in Europe with mixed success, we should say. So Roderick, what can we expect from Germany in the post-Merkel era and in the years to come? For example, we have the conference on the future of Europe, lots of ongoing big issues, the migration package, and the whole economic governance issue and the future role of the next generation EU financial instruments. So what can you tell us?
Okay, thanks, Ben. I'm not going to run through the party programs, partly because other colleagues have done that better than I have. So Ulrike's carefully gone through the sort of security and defence stuff, and Valentin Keilinger for CEPS has gone through some of the broader European issues. Partly also because I think that a lot of these positions are going to get lost in the kind of Rubik's Cube of coalition formation. And I, as a non-German, simply don't understand that. When somebody turns around to me and says there may be 900 MPs in the next German parliament, I think, okay, if you say so, and then I have to go away and do some research, whereas Germans just sort of nod their heads and go, oh yes. It's all slightly mysterious to me. What I can do, I think, is report from the sort of Berlin bubble as a foreigner, because I mean, to me, is what's interesting, I think, is that there's a kind of cross-party shift, I think, in the way that Germany organizes the substance and the structure of its statecraft. And when I say a sort of cross-party shift, I think actually what I'm talking about is that because international issues haven't played a huge role in this election campaign, it actually matters what the sort of strategic community in Berlin thinks about these issues. And I think there's a bit of a sort of consensus in Berlin about how Germany ought to organize itself internationally, no matter the stripe of the next German government. So I think that's worth watching, whatever coalition comes, because I think there's been a sort of shift in the debate. And for me, both in the substance and the structure of the next government, what it feels like is that Germany is becoming more French. The debate is about European capacity to act and autonomy, and it's about a slightly sort of top-heavy and centralized form of organizing Germany's foreign policy. And to me, that is slightly sort of historically ignorant and slightly alien to Germany's constitutional structures. I worry a little bit that this centralization of power blanks out the experience of sort of 60 years of relatively successful German statecraft in the world, and also a relatively successful European geopolitics based on an attempt to sort of meld French and German statecraft on even terms. I say that, though, as I say, as a sort of outsider in the debate. I am British and have worked in Poland and Sweden, so I have a sort of inbuilt suspicion of the Franco-German motor. And secondly, my background experience is sort of Home Affairs and Schengen, which for me is quite a successful form of European geopolitics, precisely because it mixes a sort of French grand geostrategy with a sort of German sense of diffuse power and networks, and tries to meld it in interesting ways. And I think the Schengen project has been rather sort of ruined by an attempt by Germany to play geopolitics. So that by way of background. speaking to the people in the bubble, for me, the way they judge the party programs is entirely on French terms. So it's, firstly, it's it's less on the party's sort of affinity with the EU. It's very much through the lens of the Élysée Treaty or the Aachen Treaty, the sort of Anschlussfähigkeit with France, the ability for France and Germany to act as a motor and throw up new sort of European initiatives. On domestic affairs or on the sort of internal dimension of EU affairs, I feel like the first benchmark on things like Eurozone reform, the recovery funds and so on is always, to what degree is this party ready to cooperate with the French when it comes to fiscal policy, when it comes to the black zero, when it comes to sort of tearing up debt breaks. And there's something similar, I think, on international affairs. Where are the Greens on the Eurofighter? Where are they on overseas deployments? When we're thinking of party management, again, the benchmark seems to be to what degree can leaders cooperate with Macron and bring their parties with them. So Armin Laschet may talk a good game when it comes to cooperating with Macron, but he's hired Friedrich Merz, the former leader of the party in the Bundestag, on economic affairs. He's a blast from the past when it comes to sort of fiscal discipline and so on. Is he really able to cooperate with Macron? And I think finally, when people here are thinking about sort of where Germany should lead, then they tend to pull out those few issues where there's a legitimate point of difference to France. So that's the case, for example, on energy policy and this sort of big divergence between France and Germany about whether nuclear power should count as clean fuel as the French would like under the Green Deal. And it seems sort of legitimate for a German government of any stripe to make the case that it should not and have a sort of fight with France on that. So, I mean, in short, when it comes to the substance of the party positions, I feel like talking to the people here in Berlin, their first kind of benchmark is how well individual parties are able to cooperate with France and with Macron. And I feel that kind of runs through, secondly, this question of how Germany organizes its statecraft. So, there's across all the parties a debate about streamlining German foreign policy decision-making, centralizing it around the chancellery, and bringing sort of individual German line ministries, the finance ministry, interior ministry, etc., in line with the chancellery on the international level. So the debates are around, do we set up a national security council? Do we revamp the Bundessicherheitsrat? Do we create a national security advisor with ministerial rank, capable of sort of deciding on security issues that divide the cabinet? Oh, hello, Bjorn's dog. Do we move the Europe minister to the chancellery, etc.? And again, that's kind of where the party programs are being judged. And I think even the SPD, which is sort of deeply reluctant to see moves like the setting up of a national security council, are still being judged on those terms. And it's kind of welcomed a little bit that even the SPD seems sort of willing and able to sort of rethink the way that it organizes German foreign and European policy, particularly around the idea of sort of leveraging the Brussels effect. So a more sort of top-heavy approach to European affairs, whereby the European Union tries to leverage its massive consumer markets, essentially putting up protections around individual European market projects, deepening internal rules, and then leveraging access to the European Union in order to sort of spread those rules to foreign businesses and foreign governments. So long story short, from where I'm sitting, there is a kind of Frenchification of German statecraft that I feel is going to come one way or another after these elections. And the debate is very much, when will Germany be able to respond to Macron? Are we able to supplement France with a sort of Franco-German motor? Very quickly, Implications for Sweden, bad news as far as I'm concerned. So, I mean, firstly, I think the centralization of power around the Chancellor, if that's what happens, doesn't streamline German foreign policy. It sidelines the foreign ministry, downgrades it within the sort of coalition portfolio, and you get to a situation where I think the Chancellery and the individual line ministry starts handling international affairs. That means that it's focused more on crisis management, and it does so in individual silos. So we've spent the last 10 to 15 years hopping from one sort of siloed crisis to the next, the Eurozone crisis, the Schengen crisis, the COVID crisis, without any sense of how they link up. And I fear that that then continues, because as far as I'm concerned, the mishandling of one of these crises has always kind of cascaded into the next. And this very strange German habit of treating each one individually and as a sort of opportunity to deepen European integration is worrying. Second point, I think it brings out the worst of both French and German statecraft if we go down this path. So things like the Brussels effect are, to me, a mixture of French protectionism and German overregulation. You know, it's French protectionism to put up barriers around individual market projects. Germany says, oh, good, let's deepen internal rules, and then together they say, and let's leverage market access in order to assert those rules on Chinese businesses, on China, etc. Fine if it works, but there's this danger that you smother the EU in red tape. You cut us off from our neighbours and from international markets. And instead of innovation, we're sort of over-regulating these things. I can see Ulrike being skeptical, but that's okay. Third point, and then I shut up. If we have some kind of Franco-German directoire, even a sort of misfiring one, then for Sweden as a non-Eurozone member state, it's in trouble, as are Poland, Hungary, and other peripheral member states. I think over the last sort of 5 years or so, you've seen this habit of Macron politicizing things that didn't necessarily need to be politicized in order to try to get a sort of sharp European response, taking it up to the European Council, threatening to exclude member states that sort of drag their feet, and then Germany kind of grudgingly saying, well, we need a sort of inclusive European approach on this. So taking it to the European Commission, trying to leverage the internal market and saying to sort of member states that would otherwise be excluded, here's a way to get on board. You just need to accept this sort of Franco-German compromise within the Commission framework. I think if that continues, then a member state like Sweden will be in trouble. So yeah, there we are. Watch out for the Franco-German axis as far as I'm concerned. But as I say, I'm talking as a Brit here, so take that with a pinch of salt, Ulrike, nodding her head. All right.
Thank you, Roderick, for both going down to the kind of nuts and bolts of policymaking and also for your warning to us peripheral countries. We'll return to you soon, but I would like to just hand over to Tim. Tim, we've been studying an increasingly assertive China and its relation to the EU in different projects during your time here at the Institute, looking at the technical standards, 5G, to name a few examples. And I guess traditionally Germany has preferred to separate economic issues and political issues. And I guess Nord Stream 2 is a good example of that. While the global trend is really the reverse, the blending and even weaponization of economic issues for political gains. So will Germany have to adopt to this new reality? And perhaps it's already started. And can we expect a more kind of hawkish Germany in its relation to China in the coming years? Please.
Well, if I listen to Roderick, my sense is that he hopes that we won't get there, because looking from it, well, I'm I'm overstating here, of course. Well, I mean, to start with that, I think if Germany in Europe doesn't learn to leverage better its market power and access to the European single market, then goodbye European or German China policy. With that, I'd say I'd start to make a blunt and maybe a bit provocative statement, and this is that the last 16 years of German China policy have been a disaster. And what I think, and I've been watching this mostly from the outside, living in Sweden, living in other European countries. I've been away for more than half a decade from Germany now, and I think that this German prioritization of economic interests, German economic interests. I mean, when you talk to German policymakers, you very often get the impression that German interests are simply equated with European ones. So when they use Europe, they could also plug in Germany, and then it would be more appropriate when it comes to China. And I don't want to be sound too optimistic, but I think that 16 years of Merkel coming to an end at least offer an opportunity for a revision of German China policy. How much this is going to materialize, I'll try to assess a bit in the coming minutes. But just to name that, I think you're absolutely right. Economic affairs and political values have largely been separated under Merkel. On top of that, not only have economic interests been taken premise, but also Merkel's governments have always taken a quite, say, pragmatic approach. So approaching issues of political values mainly behind closed doors. Then, of course, mentioning it in the press conference, but always trying to avoid calling China out, always arguing, well, we do it the pragmatic way. And I think that this is in part, of course, paying tribute to German economic interests. Germany by far has the largest largest dependence on the Chinese market among European Union member states. 9 to 10% of German exports go to China. But I think also, frankly, that it is driven in part by Merkel's belief in China's strength and her belief that to some extent, that's what we are left with. We need to deal with China as it is. Whether that's correct or not is going beyond the scope of this lunch discussion, I think. But I think that has been driving it a lot. What it gives me a bit hope is several issues. One is that German industry itself is starting to review its own position on China. You may remember that the BDE, the German Industry Association, in early 2019, for the first time called China, among others, also a systemic rival. And I think what is behind that is that German industry realizes that short-term economic gains may still come from China, but it's a quite near future where we may end up as German industry as well, being more on the receiving end, because we rely so much on China. We have sold out so much to China that and we face so unlevel playing fields that this is not in the economic interest of German industry anymore. I don't say that there's no German business lobbying for good relations with China anymore. I'm just saying German industry, in my view, is not as unified as it used to be a couple of years ago, which of course provides a bit more leeway, a bit more leverage for those that want to have a more, I would say, realistic and less naive China policy. Second point that gives me hope is the changing international environment. If I may connect that to my third point, to different parties and the candidates, for example, not so unlikely chancellor as it looks right now, Olaf Scholz, I think, has always tried to avoid a clear messaging on China, as far as I can see. If I look at what I would assume what he would like to do is probably not going tough on China. But at the same time, I'm not so sure this preference is so strong that he would withstand sort of an international environment, both within Europe but primarily across the Atlantic, to really not change Germany's China policy. So I think that is another issue. What would be interesting here is to discuss sort of how the dynamic across the Atlantic plays into that. But that I think also goes a bit beyond the discussion today. So the third issue then, the third point of hope are the parties, at least to some extent. I'll be very brief in running through them. The Conservatives, CDU and CSU. I think it's a divided party that is waiting to discuss China after Merkel's leave. You have two central figures at the moment in the party that stand for really opposing directions. One is Angela Merkel herself, and the other is Norbert Röttgen, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the German parliament. Röttgen really seeing China as the issue, the number one crucial issue on foreign affairs to tackle, having a very tough approach on China, Merkel being sort of really the opposite. Röttgen has a lot of support within the current members of the German parliament on substance, but they avoid sort of that conflict as much as possible, I'd say now. The question here is, of course, is with Merkel out of the equation, is it then all tilting towards Röttgen? And I'm not entirely sure. Laschet has said, the candidate, that he dislikes feel-good moralizing, that he thinks that leads nowhere. Laschet has also been in favor of including Huawei into the 5G network, etc., etc. CSU is a topic of itself. It has a long tradition of cooperating with the Chinese Communist Party, already under Mao Zedong. But that's an issue in itself. I do see growing criticism there too. All in all, I'd say the Conservatives, if they run the government, they will probably preserve most of what we have at the moment. Social Democrats is a bit of everything. They talk also, when you look into the party program, they talk about human rights violations as well as needs for cooperation. It's kind of pick what you like. By the way, it's a bit the same in the CDU, CSU program. So I don't think that the programs tell us that much when it comes to traditionally large parties. I've already said Scholz is avoiding any sort of concrete action. Maas, the foreign minister, was about to deliver a quite transatlantic, quite critical speech of China when he was caught in the Afghanistan issue. He has also welcomed the pro-democracy leader of Hong Kong, Joshua Wong, recently. But frankly, after would be interesting to see what Roderick and Ulrike think. But I doubt that after the Afghanistan disaster, we will need to think about Maas as the future foreign minister of Germany. But if he stayed on that ticket, if he influenced foreign policy making among the Social Democrats, then I think he would probably be more critical than Scholz has been. And now very briefly, because I think that is a very quick story about the Greens and the Liberals, the FDP and the Green Party. Greens very clear in their principled commitment to change China policy in Germany, ranging from tech to hegemonic aspirations in international affairs to systemic rivalry, Taiwan. Maybe the only question mark you could put up is climate. We need to cooperate with on climate, but I've not seen anyone in the Green Party saying that the need to cooperate on climate should really change the course on China and those other issues. And also, if you think in terms of the people standing behind that, Baerbock, Omid Nuripur, Margarete Bause, Reinhard Bütikofer, they are all more or less China hawks, maybe with one exception, which is Jürgen Trittin. But frankly, I think the Greens are set for a tougher China approach. And it's almost the same with the Liberals. I think maybe a bit more interest in economic aspects. But as I said, even sort of the business community in Germany is not united in lobbying for the preservation of the status quo. So also there, if you run through the program, it's Taiwan, it's Hong Kong, it's ethnic minorities. So it seems to be a very classical liberal democratic approach shaping that. And also, if you look at the people, Lindner, even Christian Lindner has made very clear statements with regard to China recently. Someone who could become defense minister, Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, very clear on China. Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, also pretty clear on China. So these are all sort of, I think, positive signs. And I personally would expect that both Greens and Liberals are very likely to end up in the government. So in that sense, I mean, as Ulrike said, it depends a bit on who takes which portfolio. But the inclusion of both of these smaller parties makes me quite optimistic that also, that's sort of my third point, that also from the domestic landscape you see. And also, I think what I could add here is that if you look at public opinion polls, they are all consistent that the German public is willing to even pay an economic price for getting tougher on China. This, I think, should also have an impact on the parties. Finally, why didn't I talk about Left Party and AfD? Because personally, I think they're irrelevant, will be irrelevant for the formation of the government. We can have a debate, of course, about the Left Party. They would be very much in favor of developing friendlier relations with China, but I personally don't think that will be relevant. Ministries getting tougher on China too over the last years. I think there's also sort of a process. It's still a process in the making, but I think you will also have the bureaucratic support for changing China policy if the political will is there. Just one final aspect here. I think that while I'm quite optimistic that no matter who wins the elections, we will and whoever will sit in the chancellery, China will get tougher on China. I would certainly subscribe to that. Angela Merkel being out of this equation will make a difference. What I doubt most is, and fear most, is whether this new German-China policy will be a more European one, or whether once more it will be taken very much from a Berlin-centric perspective. And here I'd say, even if you talk with someone like Norbert Röttgen, it doesn't sound very European. It very much sounds like we're gonna sit down here in Berlin, we're gonna review that, we're gonna make a decision, and then we will revise German-China policy. And again, sometimes they use the word Europe, but you could exchange it with German and it would be more exactly describing what they're talking about. So that to me is sort of the uphill battle at the moment. And then of course, the devil lies in the details. Sorry for the long speech.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm just reminding the audience that please put away your sandwich and type questions to our excellent panel, either here in Zoom or on Facebook. But I already have some question here from Ulrike. You reacted to what Roderick was talking about, and possibly also waving while Tim was speaking. So please, you have the microphone.
Yeah, actually, just very briefly, I wanted to add one point, and that indeed works with both what Roderick and Tim said. Namely, I think we're in an interesting situation when it comes to Germany's position in Europe and its leadership in Europe, because for the last, pretty much 16 years, Germany has played a role of kind of integrating force within the EU. And what I mean by this, I mean, not that Germany hasn't done kind of things that not everyone in Europe liked, but I think the German government under Angela Merkel has always really emphasized the importance of the EU27, not going it alone, actually kind of pushed back on France on that a little bit. And so kind of has played this role of keeping the EU together. And I think a lot of Europeans, especially in the smaller member states, actually really appreciated that, which is why Germany right now is actually seen very positively by Europeans. And we ran this amazing poll recently that said that lots of Europeans would actually really like Angela Merkel as a kind of president of Europe. The challenge now is that because of this integrating force that Germany was, a lot of Europeans are looking to Germany to lead, right? We always have this question of leadership. of Europe in Germany. And I think Germany actually has quite a bit of legitimacy to lead on a number of issues. But the problem, of course, is that if you want to lead, it's going to be impossible to always have everyone on board, right? So you kind of, what made Germany big in Europe, politically speaking, will now need to be abandoned to do what the Europeans want Germany to do. And that's a super interesting situation, a really thin line to walk. And the funny thing is, and this kind of works well with those previous interventions, when you actually ask Europeans, and we ran a poll at ECFR, when you ask Europeans, in what areas could Germany lead Europe? Europeans say, Germany is good on kind of human rights issues and on economic and financial issues. However, when it comes to the geopolitical questions, the numbers go down drastically. So I think less than 20% of Europeans think that Germany can lead on China, as was kind of pointed out by Tim, can lead on the transatlantic relationship, can lead on the Russian relationship. Surprisingly enough, I think almost 27 or so % of Europeans said that Germany can lead on European defense. And I think that number is too high. But yeah, I think that was an interesting point to make. And I wanted to defend the Brussels effect against Roderick, but maybe that goes too far now. So just have my kind of protest noted that I actually think that the Brussels effect is something that has worked pretty well for the EU and maybe worth pursuing further, although it is, of course, not without fault. But yeah, I don't want to monopolize the discussion on that. So.
Thank you, Ulrike. And yeah, I did see your polling, but on the other hand, it's quite striking that Germany got so much confidence to lead on the economic issues. I mean, you wouldn't have guessed that 10 years ago during the Euro crisis, but now we are at that point. So perhaps it could change also on the geopolitical side. On geopolitics, we have a question here from the audience to whoever wants to reply to it. It reads like this. On Baltic security, will Germany be prepared to defend the Baltic states, Poland, and other NATO allies with the use of armed force against Russia? And would Germany help Finland or Sweden as EU members if attacked by Russia? In short, is Germany prepared to stand up to Russia? And sorry, does it matter who's sitting in the government?
Right. So very broadly speaking, and I think quite honestly, this has been true for ever since I can remember, there isn't enormous public support for basically an Article 5 situation within NATO. So if you actually ask Germans, like, would you use military force to defend an ally that is being attacked? The numbers aren't great. However, I personally don't really worry about this because this is a government decision, and the government definitely stands behind NATO and stands behind Article 5 also because they know that it works for us. And so yes, very broadly speaking, in this kind of general scenario, if an ally gets attacked by whoever, Germany would definitely support that ally. Whether this specifically means sending military power or not, I mean, it's a bit tricky to kind of just theorize about this, but I'm broadly speaking, I'm not worried about Germany's commitment to NATO's Article 5. And I would go so far and say it doesn't really matter who's in government, because this is a kind of general situation. I mean, if we end up getting a coalition, a really left-wing coalition that includes the Linke party, so what we call red, red, green, but would be red, green, red, then all these kind of defense questions become much more tricky but it has a really low likelihood. The Linke party quite literally is against all kinds of foreign deployments. They actually want Germany to bring back the troops that are currently being stationed in the Baltic countries for NATO. So they want to abolish NATO. And I mean, this is really a really left-wing party, but I'd say the likelihood of this government coming about is maybe, I don't know, 2%. So I think this is the only government where I'd say in that situation, the whole NATO question will be bigger. But other than that, no, I'm not really worried. That being said, Germany's Russia policy is tricky. I mean, for those interested, and because we didn't talk about Russia at all, I just yesterday published a piece where I went through all the election programs and actually put together kind of tables saying, okay, so what do they say on the US? What do they say on China? What do they say on Russia? So people can look that up. Very broadly speaking, all parties but the extremes support the Russia sanctions, for example. but several parties are kind of trying to improve the relationship with Russia somewhat, kind of trying to find ways that it isn't so adversarial. Personally, I think, honestly, the ball on that is in Russia's court, so I don't think that we can do anything on the adversarial relationship with Russia. But yeah, there are some different views on Russia, broadly speaking. But yeah, on Article 5 and NATO support, that's not what keeps me up at night and should keep the Baltics or the Polish up at night, would be my assessment.
Just thinking, if we widen the discussion from NATO to more general, also transatlantic relations, I mean, all of the issues that you've been discussing, China, European tech regulation or regulatory ambitions of Europe in general, security cooperation is really part of some sort of new transatlantic agreement. For decades, it was more about Russia and European loyalty for US interests, and now it's definitely about tech regulation, China, etc. Where will Germany position itself there? I mean, if you look at the polls, Germany has been pretty explicit on the fact that a lot of Germans seems to seek a lot of autonomy, especially in the relation between the US and China, while Germany also has a very strong tradition of being staunch allies to the US and being very fond of the transatlantic link. What is the long game here? And I know, Tim, you mentioned this, but you said it was beyond the scope, and now I widen the scope, so please.
Yeah, well, after all, that should probably be discussed by a transatlantic expert, but I can try at least to make sense of a bit. I'm not so sure, just as Ulrike mentioned with regard to the Baltic and commitment to NATO, whether public sentiments on the transatlantic partnership will be the most influential in that question, how Germany is positioning itself. Again, of course, if you have the left party as part of the government, we have a different story, but for the sake of argument, let's keep that really unlikely option out of the picture. Also, since the polls for the left party stand around 6-7%, so I don't think that there will be any sort of pressure from the electorate for the Social Democrats or the Greens to say, well, but we're gonna do this, and even the majority of the Social Democratic supporters would prefer not to have a coalition with Die Linke. But that's again domestic. So you asked for the transatlantic angle. I think, well, in the very beginning, when Joe Biden won the U.S. elections, and the first weeks after Joe Biden had taken office, you could hear quite some frustration from Paris about Berlin dropping quite a number of proposals or projects and their commitment for a more autonomous Europe that would sort of not keep equidistance to the US and China, but would also not lean so much on the transatlantic partner. And in that regard, it felt that Germany was tilting sort of more back to the transatlantic partnership. In recent weeks, my impression from afar is a bit, but that's sort of more on this general observation, that there is some form of realization that the transatlantic partner, even under Joe Biden, may not be as comfortable as Germans wanted it to be. I think it was foreseeable, to be honest, and I think I'm not the only one who foresaw it. That's why I say as Germans wanted it to be. Where that precisely ends, where we finally fall in Germany, I find a bit difficult to say at the moment. Maybe somewhere in between. I do think that we will see Germany and Europe in general realizing that, of course, a closer transatlantic cooperation is necessary. But I do think that on China, there remain differences. Differences sort of, I mean, it's true that Joe Biden keeps saying that in contrast to Donald Trump, his main concern is not China's rise as such, but China's authoritarianism. And that, of course, and the preservation of a rules-based international order. The question here is, I mean, how rules-based is it, and is the US always preserving the rules-based international order? Well, that's a general question we could have for years and decades, probably. But the main question here is sort of how correct is that assessment, or isn't the US much more worried than Europeans, including Germans, about a shift in power, and how far is Europe sort of willing to walk with the US? And that, I think, is up in the air. I'm not entirely sure. When it comes to the Transatlantic Trade and Tech Council, and really just one sentence on that, because I speak too long already again. I mean, it's a positive development, of course, that there is some cooperation there. I wonder sometimes sort of what is really in, and whether the two sides, well, I think there's two challenges here. One is the capabilities on both sides of the Atlantic, even the level of information on both sides of the Atlantic is so uneven that the question really is, what role can Europeans play in that transatlantic partnership on technology? I'm not saying we should abandon it. I just want to lower sort of our expectations from that. And also, I do think, given that we talk from so different starting points and so different domestic conditions, I think it will take quite a while to come to terms and to understand what can be low-hanging fruits and what can be achieved through the TTC. And so my hope is more with TTC that it helps Europeans to come to terms with one another, and being sort of forced to approach that from a European perspective, there would be more internal coordination within Europe. I'm not so optimistic how far-reaching that transatlantic cooperation can be at this point.
Thank you very much, Tim. We have a question here from Facebook that Roderick claims. Will the next chancellor be able to take on and continue Merkel's role as Europe's leader? And I'll give you just 2 minutes for that, and then I'll actually let Ulrike either wrap up if you have any final thoughts, or answer a very specific question on nuclear sharing, in case you prefer. So that's my dog making sounds. Over to you, Roderick.
Have I switched? Yeah, cool. Yeah, on this leadership question, three mini points. The first bit of the question is whether Laschet would if he's chancellor, sort of share leadership with Macron. I fear he would, to stick with our theme. I mean, if you look at how he's positioned himself during this election, he has allowed the leader of the FDP to claim certain topics around, for example, tax policy and economic policy, because he wants to build a strong coalition with the FDP. So he's kind of setting the FDP up to be a strong coalition partner, and that sort of behaviour is precisely why his lead in the polls has dropped, because he's seen as not sharp on certain issues. Look, Ulrike shaking her head again. But I think, if you look at anybody who would go into a sort of power sharing agreement, then it would probably be Laschet. It seems to be within his DNA. Secondly, would Macron then be the leader of Europe? He's done a fairly good job over the last sort of 2 or 3 years of squandering that lead. And I think, it's interesting to see that he's tried to head off, for example, Spain reaching out to the Netherlands on European affairs, and their bid to kind of leapfrog the Franco-German tandem by creating an alliance with Draghi and the Italians. So he's doing his best to sort of secure his leadership role, but I wonder if a move like that doesn't actually end up sort of strengthening Draghi at his expense. And Draghi, of course, could also play a strong leadership role. Third point, I think in many of the debates that we have here in Berlin, it's often about the rule of law, about Poland and Hungary. I think people are looking at Orban as the sort of the longest serving sort of European head of state or government after Merkel, and the one who, from that perspective, sort of inherits her mantle within the European Council, the person who, for better or worse, probably for worse, understands best the way that the European Union works at that high level. So these are my three thoughts on European leadership. Ulrike, are you nodding your head?
I'll hand over directly to Ulrike, and then we need to close the seminar. If you have any instant feedback to Roderick or a very quick answer on the nuclear sharing question, and then we need to close.
Yes, I've been nodding along to many things that you said, Roderick, but yes, we also have some disagreements, which makes this much more fun. No, just a kind of very quick point on kind of the European leadership question. I mean, I guess Macron will never be able to take on such a European leadership role as Angela Merkel did. And I think this primarily has to do with the fact, as I was mentioning, you know, Germany under Merkel was very much disintegrating force, kind of trying to bring everyone along. Again, it didn't always work, you know, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely the idea. And Macron is very much a proponent of this avant-garde idea. You know, let's work with those who want and who can, and let's leave the others behind, if you like. And that just, of course, is not super popular in Europe. So he, you know, and all his ideas, if you bring forward lots of ideas, some people are going to like it, but some people are going to hate it. And if you don't bring forward any ideas, more people are going to like you. So I think that's rather obvious. And I just, one kind of final thought I want to leave the listeners with. Of course, the Franco-German relationship really matters. But we have a problem here insofar as, in all likelihood, the coalition building in Germany after the 26th of September will take quite a long time. I mean, again, we don't know, but it could definitely take a few months. And then, of course, we're in 2022, and that's when the French election cycle starts. And we've already seen this 5 years ago at Macron's campaign. He needs to be careful not to be seen as too close to Germany. Marine Le Pen, this was always one of her main attack lines of, you know, Macron basically cozying up to Germany, cozying up to Angela Merkel. So he will have very little leeway in terms of, you know, working with the Germans in 2022. And so I don't expect any kind of real development here anytime soon. Hopefully he'll get reelected, or at least, you know, it's not Marine Le Pen. And we can then restart this Franco-German relationship between the new chancellor and either, you know, the old or new French president. But yeah, just to keep that in mind, that yeah, it's going to be an interesting few months, or indeed basically a year.
Okay, Ulrike, Roderick, and Tim, thank you so much for your views and expertise. You gave us lots of things to think about, both in the 9 days that are left for the election, but even more importantly, stuff to consider in the future when strategizing with or against or in relation to Germany in the coming years in the foreign policy field. So thank you very much, and thank you also to the audience staying with us and asking good questions to the panels. Thank you.